The sound of my mother's laughter echoing through the kitchen walls still haunts me 43 years later. But it wasn't the warm, loving laughter I had grown up with. It was something else entirely cold, calculating, conspiratorial. I pressed my ear closer to the door that October afternoon in 1973, my heart hammering against my ribs as I heard Alan's voice respond. She doesn't suspect a thing. Andy has always been too naive, just like her father. Their shared laughter that followed felt like ice water flooding my veins. I was 20 years old, standing in the hallway of what I thought was my future home, discovering that the two people I trusted most in the world were plotting against me. But I'm getting ahead of myself. Let me start from the beginning, when I still believed in fairy tales and happy endings. My name is Andy, and this is the story of how I learned that sometimes the greatest strength comes from the deepest betrayal, and how the darkest nights can give birth to the brightest dawn. The mountains surrounding Denver had already received their first snow that winter of 1972, when my father, Anthony Moretti, first complained of the pain in his back. I remember the exact moment we were decorating our small Christmas tree in the living room of our house in the Highlands neighborhood. Dad winced as he reached up to place the star on top his weathered hand, pressing against his lower back. "Just getting old, little bird," he said, using the pet name he'd called me since childhood. His Italian accent, inherited from his immigrant parents, made everything sound like music. "Bus driving isn't easy on an old man's bones." But I knew my father. At 48, he was still strong enough to carry passengers' luggage, still quick enough to break up fights between rowdy teenagers on his route. This was different. I saw it in the way he moved more carefully, the way his usually bright brown eyes, sometimes clouded with pain, he tried to hide. My mother Irene noticed too, though she pretended not to. She had her own way of dealing with problems, ignoring them until they became impossible to avoid. She was a beautiful woman, even at 42, with auburn hair she kept perfectly styled and green eyes that could flash with warmth or ice, depending on her mood. She made a modest living as a seamstress for the wealthy ladies of Denver, creating elaborate gowns for their social events. "Anthony, you should see a doctor," she would say while hemming a dress, not looking up from her work. "Doctors cost money we don't have," he would reply, settling into his worn leather chair with the Denver Post. "Then work less, take some time off, and eat what pay rent with what." This conversation repeated itself with variations for months. My father was proud, stubborn, and practical. He came from people who worked until they dropped, who viewed complaining as weakness. But by March of 1973, even his legendary Italian stubbornness couldn't hide what was happening to his body. I found him one morning in the bathroom, doubled over the toilet, vomiting blood. His face was gray sweat beading on his forehead despite the cool morning air. "Papa here." I rushed to his side, my nursing instincts from the first aid course I'd taken at the community college kicking in. "It's nothing, little bird, something I ate." But we both knew it wasn't nothing. That afternoon, I called in sick to my job at Morrison's Bakery and dragged him to Denver General Hospital. The emergency room was crowded, smelling of disinfectant and fear. We waited 4 hours before a tired-looking doctor with kind eyes examined him. The tests took another week. X-rays, blood work, a biopsy that left my father weak and uncomfortable. When Dr. Patterson called us back into his office, I knew from his expression that our world was about to change forever. "Mr. Moretti, I'm afraid the news isn't good. You have prostate cancer and it's already spread to your lymph nodes and bones. Stage 4. The words hit me like physical blows. Stage 4, advanced, aggressive. I had read enough to know what that meant, even if my father hadn't. "How long?" my father asked quietly, his calloused hands folded in his lap. "With treatment, possibly 6 months to a year. Without treatment?" Dr. Patterson's voice trailed off. "And with treatment, what kind of life would I have? The chemotherapy is difficult. You'd be sick most of the time. There would be pain management, but..." My father nodded slowly, as if he'd been expecting this conversation his entire life. "Thank you for being honest, doctor. We need to discuss this as a family." The drive home was silent, except for the sound of my mother crying in the passenger seat. Dad drove carefully, both hands on the wheel, his jaw set in that determined way I knew so well. When we pulled into our driveway, he turned off the engine and sat for a moment looking at our small house with its peeling paint and overgrown garden. "We're going to fight this," I said fiercely. "We'll get the money for treatment. I'll work extra shifts. Mom can take on more clients." "Andy." His voice was gentle but firm. "Look at me." I turned to meet his eyes, those warm brown eyes that had comforted me through childhood nightmares and teenage heartbreaks. "I've lived a good life. I married a beautiful woman, raised a wonderful daughter, worked honestly for 30 years. Some men never get that much. You're not giving up. I'm being realistic. The treatment would bankrupt us and buy me a few months of misery. That's not living, little bird. That's just postponing dying." My mother's sobs grew louder. "Anthony, please, there has to be something." He reached over and took her hand. "Irene, my love, you knew when you married a bus driver that we'd never be rich. But we've been rich in the ways that matter. We have love. We have each other. We have memories that no cancer can touch." That night, I lay in my childhood bed, listening to my parents talking in low voices in their room. Occasionally, I could hear my mother crying, and my father's voice steady and soothing, comforting her as he had always done. I stared at the ceiling, trying to process the fact that my father, my hero, my anchor, the strongest man I'd ever known, was dying. The next months passed in a blur of stolen moments and desperate hope. My father chose to forego aggressive treatment, opting instead for pain management that would let him remain alert and functional for as long as possible. He continued driving his bus route until his supervisor, Mr. Chen, noticed him struggling with the steering wheel and gently suggested it was time to take medical leave. I watched my father shrink before my eyes, not just physically, but in the way he moved through the world. The man who had once carried me on his shoulders through the Cherry Creek Mall now needed help getting up from his chair. The hands that had taught me to tie my shoes and braid my hair became thin and shaky, the skin translucent as paper. But his spirit remained unbroken. He used his remaining time to teach me things he said I'd need to know. How to change the oil in our old Chevelle. How to negotiate with landlords and bill collectors. How to read people's true intentions beneath their pretty words. "Life will test you, little bird," he said one afternoon as we sat on the front porch watching the neighborhood children play in the street. "People will try to take advantage of your kind heart. Promise me you'll be smart about who you trust." "I promise, Papa. Your mother, she's not as strong as she seems. She's going to need you to be the strong one now." I nodded, though the thought terrified me. I was only 20 years old, working as a bakery clerk, barely keeping up with my own life. How could I be strong for both of us? As autumn arrived, bringing with it the gorgeous Colorado foliage, my father began spending more time in bed. The pain medication made him drowsy, but in his lucid moments, he would tell me stories about his childhood in Italy, about meeting my mother at a church dance, about the day I was born. "You came into this world fighting," he said with a weak smile. "The doctor said he'd never seen a baby so determined to be heard. You had these tiny fists, and you were swinging them at everything. Maybe I knew I'd need to fight. Maybe you did." On a cold November morning, I woke to find my mother sitting at the kitchen table, still in her nightgown, staring at a cup of coffee that had long since grown cold. "Mom," she looked up at me with eyes so empty they seemed to belong to a stranger. "He's gone, Andy. Your father is gone." I ran to their bedroom and found him lying peacefully, his face relaxed for the first time in months. His battle was over, but ours was just beginning. The funeral was held at St. Catherine's, the same church where my parents had married 22 years earlier. It seemed like half of Denver showed up: bus drivers, passengers, neighbors, people whose lives my father had touched in small but meaningful ways. Story after story was shared about his kindness, his reliability, his willingness to help anyone in need. But as I stood beside his casket, accepting condolences from people whose names I barely knew, I felt a profound loneliness settling into my bones. My anchor was gone. The one person who had always believed in me, always protected me, always made me feel safe in an uncertain world, was now just memories and fading photographs. The weeks following the funeral passed in a haze of paperwork and grief. My father had left us with exactly $347 in the bank, a house with a mortgage and funeral expenses that wiped out even that meager amount. I took on extra shifts at the bakery, working 7 days a week to keep us afloat. My mother seemed to exist in a fog, sitting for hours in my father's chair, staring at nothing. Then, gradually, she began to change in ways that disturbed me. She started spending money we didn't have on new clothes, expensive perfumes, makeup. She would disappear for hours without explanation, returning home with shopping bags and vague stories about running errands. "Mom, where did you get the money for this?" I asked one evening, holding up a designer dress I'd found hanging in her closet. "I sold some of your father's things," she said, without meeting my eyes. "His tools, some books. We don't need them anymore." But I had looked in the garage. Dad's tools were still there, covered in dust, but untouched. Something was wrong, but I was too exhausted and grief-stricken to investigate further. It was during this difficult period that Alan first walked into Morrison's bakery. I noticed him immediately, not because he was particularly handsome, though he was attractive in a polished, urban way that stood out in our working-class neighborhood. It was his confidence that caught my attention. He moved through the bakery like he owned it, scanning the display cases with the air of someone accustomed to having choices. "Good morning," he said, approaching my counter. His voice was cultured, educated, with just a hint of an accent I couldn't place. "I'll take a loaf of your sourdough and—" He paused, studying me intently. "Perhaps you could recommend something sweet to go with my coffee." I felt heat rising in my cheeks under his gaze. "The apple turnovers are fresh from the oven," I managed. "Perfect. And you are—" "Andy." "Andy." He repeated my name like he was tasting it. "I'm Alan Blackwood. I just opened a law practice a few blocks from here. I have a feeling I'm going to become a very regular customer." He returned the next day and the day after that. Always during my shift, always with that same intense attention that made me feel like I was the only person in the room. On his 4th visit, he brought a single red rose. "For the lovely lady who makes my morning coffee taste better," he said, offering it with a boyish grin that transformed his serious features. I don't make coffee," I protested, laughing despite myself. "Mrs. Morrison does that." "Ah, but you're here when I drink it. That makes all the difference." My coworker, Sarah, nudged me from behind the counter. "Take it, honey," she whispered. "When's the last time a man brought you flowers?" "Never, actually. I had dated a few boys in high school, but nothing serious. My father's illness and death had consumed the last 2 years of my life, leaving little room for romance. I accepted the rose, inhaling its sweet fragrance. "Thank you," I said. "It's beautiful." "Not as beautiful as your smile." The attention was intoxicating. After months of grief and worry, having someone focus on me with such intensity felt like stepping into sunlight after a long winter. Alan had a way of making me feel special, important, interesting. When he asked me to dinner that Friday, I accepted without hesitation. Our first date was at Giovanni's, an upscale Italian restaurant downtown that I'd only heard about from the wealthy ladies my mother sewed for. Alan ordered wine, spoke knowledgeably about the menu, and treated the waitstaff with exactly the right combination of friendliness and authority. He asked thoughtful questions about my life, my dreams, my family. "I'm sorry about your father," he said when I mentioned my recent loss. "It must be incredibly difficult losing someone so young." "He was only 48. I said, surprised by how easily I could talk to this relative stranger about something so personal. "Cancer took him so quickly, and now it's just you and your mother." "Yes, she's struggling. We both are." He reached across the table and covered my hand with his. "You're very brave, Andy. Not many 20-year-old women could handle such responsibility with such grace. His touch sent electricity up my arm. I had never felt anything like the combination of comfort and excitement he inspired. Here was a man who seemed to understand me, who saw strength in me that I wasn't sure I possessed. We began seeing each other regularly. Alan would pick me up after my shifts at the bakery, taking me to parts of Denver I'd never seen. Art galleries, concert halls, restaurants where the servers knew him by name. He introduced me to his colleagues, all polished professionals who treated me with the same respect they showed their wives. "You're different from the other women I've dated," he told me one evening as we walked along the Platte River. "You're genuine, real. Most of the women in my social circle are more concerned with appearances than substance." "I don't know much about your social circle," I admitted. "I'm just a bakery girl." He stopped walking and turned to face me, his green eyes serious in the fading light. "Don't ever say that. You're intelligent, kind, beautiful. You're going to make something of yourself, Andy. I can see it." When he kissed me for the first time that night, it felt like a promise of a different life, a better future, an escape from the grief and financial worry that had consumed my world. My mother's reaction to Alan was complex and in retrospect telling. When I first mentioned I was seeing someone, she seemed almost alarmed. "A lawyer? What would a lawyer want with someone like you?" The words stung, but I attributed them to her own grief and depression. When she met Alan, however, her attitude shifted dramatically. She fussed over her appearance, putting on her best dress and her mother's pearl earrings. She prepared an elaborate dinner, setting the table with our good china that hadn't been used since before my father's illness. "Mrs. Moretti," Alan said, kissing her hand in that old-world way that made her blush like a schoolgirl. "Andy has inherited your beauty, but she failed to mention your elegance." "Oh, Mr. Blackwood, you're too kind," she tittered, actually giggling like a teenager. "Please call me Irene." Throughout dinner, I watched my mother transform into someone I barely recognized. She was animated, flirtatious, even hanging on Alan's every word. She asked detailed questions about his practice, his background, his plans for the future. She seemed more interested in him than she had been in anything since my father's death. "Your daughter is very special," Alan told her as we cleared the dishes. "I hope you know how lucky you are to have raised such a remarkable young woman." "Oh, yes," my mother agreed, but something in her tone made me look at her sharply. There was an odd expression on her face, calculating and speculative. "Andy has always been accommodating." The word choice struck me as strange, but Alan seemed pleased. After he left, my mother was more animated than I'd seen her in months. "He's perfect for you," she declared, settling into my father's chair with a contentment I hadn't seen since before his illness. "Educated, successful, stable. You could do much worse than a lawyer, Andy." "I care about him, Mom. This isn't just about his career." "Of course you care about him. But caring doesn't pay bills or put food on the table. Your father cared about us, and look where that got us." Her casual dismissal of my father's love and sacrifice hit me like a slap. Dad gave everything for us. He worked himself to death providing for this family. And what do we have to show for it? Debt, grief, and this falling apart house. Alan could give you a real life, Andy. Security, status. Don't be foolish enough to throw that away for sentiment. I went to bed that night, troubled by her words, but my doubts were swept away the next day when Alan proposed. It wasn't a grand gesture, no getting down on one knee in a crowded restaurant or hiring a string quartet. Instead, it happened on a quiet Sunday afternoon as we sat in Cheeseman Park watching families play with their children on the playground. "I want that someday," he said, nodding toward a young couple pushing their toddler on a swing. "A family, a real partnership with someone I love and trust completely." "That sounds wonderful," I agreed, imagining our own children playing in this same park. He turned to me, then his expression more serious than I'd ever seen it. "Andy, I know we haven't been together very long, but sometimes you just know when something is right. You're right for me. We're right together." He pulled a small velvet box from his jacket pocket. "Marry me." Be my wife, my partner, my best friend. Let me take care of you the way you deserve to be taken care of." The ring was beautiful, a simple solitaire that caught the afternoon light and threw it back in tiny rainbows. But more beautiful than the ring was the love I saw in his eyes, the promise of a future free from the financial insecurity and loneliness that had shadowed my life since my father's death. "Yes," I whispered, and when he slipped the ring onto my finger, it felt like my real life was finally beginning. We set the wedding date for December 15th, just 8 months away. It would be a small ceremony. My mother and I couldn't afford anything elaborate, but Alan insisted on paying for the reception. "I want our wedding to be perfect," he said. "I want everyone to see how proud I am to be marrying you." That's when he made the suggestion that would change everything. "I've been thinking," he said one evening as we planned the seating arrangements. "Your mother is going to be alone in that big house after we're married, and honestly, my apartment feels too large for just me most of the time. What if we all lived together, at least initially? It would be practical, economical, and your mother wouldn't have to adjust to living alone so soon after losing your father." The idea surprised me. Living with one's in-laws wasn't unusual, but most couples wanted privacy in their early marriage. When I hesitated, Alan pressed his case. Think about it, darling. Your mother is still grieving, still vulnerable. She needs family around her. And frankly, we could use her help with the household expenses while I'm building my practice." When we presented the idea to my mother, her reaction was immediate and enthusiastic. "What a wonderful suggestion, Andy. You're so lucky to be marrying such a thoughtful man." "But won't we be imposing?" I asked. "Newlyweds need their privacy." "Nonsense," Alan said smoothly. "We'll have plenty of privacy. My apartment has 3 bedrooms, 2 bathrooms. Your mother can have her own space, and we'll have ours." And so 6 weeks before our wedding, we sold the little house in the Highlands where I had grown up. The proceeds, nearly $8,000, went into a joint account that Alan managed, earmarked for wedding expenses and our future together. Moving into Alan's apartment felt like stepping into a different world. Located in one of Denver's most prestigious buildings, it featured hardwood floors, crown molding, and floor-to-ceiling windows that offered sweeping views of the city and mountains. My mother was like a child in a toy store, exclaiming over the marble countertops in the kitchen, the clawfoot tub in her bathroom, the walk-in closets. It's like a palace," she breathed, standing in the living room with its leather furniture and crystal chandelier. "I can't believe we get to live here." For the first few weeks, it felt like playing house in some glamorous movie set. Alan was the perfect gentleman, giving me the master bedroom while he slept in the guest room, claiming he wanted to wait until after our wedding for us to share a bed officially. My mother threw herself into decorating her room and exploring the neighborhood, which offered upscale shopping and dining far beyond anything she'd experienced. But gradually, I began to notice things that didn't quite fit the fairy tale I thought I was living. The first was how often Alan worked late. During our courtship, he had always made time for me, arriving at the bakery promptly when my shift ended, never missing a planned date. Now, he frequently called to say he'd be home late, sometimes not arriving until after 10 o'clock. "The practice is growing faster than I expected," he explained when I asked about his long hours. "I have to strike while the iron is hot. Build a reputation now so we can have financial security later." It made sense, but something about his explanations felt rehearsed, like he had practiced them in advance. The second thing I noticed was how his behavior toward me began to change. The passionate attention that had swept me off my feet cooled into polite affection. He stopped bringing me flowers, stopped suggesting romantic dinners or weekend getaways. When I tried to initiate physical intimacy, he always had an excuse. He was tired, distracted by work, wanted to wait until after the wedding. "I respect you too much to rush things," he said when I pressed him about our physical relationship. "When we make love as husband and wife, it will be perfect." But his words felt hollow, and I found myself lying awake at night, wondering if I had done something wrong, something to make him lose interest in me. The third and most disturbing change was how close he and my mother had become. They spent long hours talking when they thought I was asleep, their voices low and conspiratorial. They shared private jokes during dinner, exchanged knowing looks across the room. When I walked into a room, their conversations would stop abruptly, and they would turn to me with bright, artificial smiles. "We were just discussing the wedding flowers," my mother would say, though they had been speaking too quietly for me to have heard any mention of flowers. Or Alan would claim, "Your mother was telling me about your father's family in Italy." Though I knew my mother had no interest in my father's relatives and had rarely spoken of them, the final piece of the puzzle fell into place on a cold afternoon in early November. I had left work early with a migraine and returned to the apartment unexpectedly. As I approached the front door, I could hear voices from inside my mother's laughter, bright and flirtatious, and Alan's deeper voice responding with warm amusement. I stood frozen in the hallway, key in hand, listening to a conversation that would shatter the last of my illusions. "She has no idea," my mother was saying, her voice filled with wicked satisfaction. "Andy's always been naive, just like her father. She sees what she wants to see. It's almost too easy," Alan replied, and I could hear the cruel amusement in his tone. "She's so grateful for the attention, so desperate to be taken care of, she doesn't question anything. Poor little Andy," my mother said, and they both burst into laughter. "She actually thinks this is a love story." I backed away from the door slowly, my heart pounding so loudly I was sure they would hear it. I walked aimlessly through the downtown streets for hours, trying to process what I had discovered. The man I thought loved me, the man I was supposed to marry in 6 weeks, was conspiring with my own mother. But conspiring to do what? That night at dinner, I watched them carefully, looking for signs of the betrayal I had overheard. They were perfect actors, maintaining their roles as loving fiancé and devoted mother. But now I could see through the performance. The way Alan's eyes never quite met mine when he spoke of our future. The way my mother pushed him to talk about his work as if she knew more about it than she should. The way they both watched me with a calculating interest that had nothing to do with love. After dinner, I excused myself early, claiming my headache had returned. I lay in bed staring at the ceiling, trying to decide what to do. Confront them, demand an explanation. But what if I was wrong? What if I had misunderstood their conversation? The doubt lasted until I found the documents. Unable to sleep, I crept out of my room around midnight to get a glass of water. As I passed Alan's home office, I noticed a thin line of light under the door. I pressed my ear against the wood and heard the soft clicking of typewriter keys. Alan was working late, as he so often claimed to be doing at the office. Curious, I tested the door handle. It was unlocked, something that never happened during the day. Alan always kept his office secured when he wasn't in it. Through the crack in the door, I could see him hunched over his desk, typing intently by the light of a single lamp. I should have returned to my room, but something compelled me to wait. After 20 minutes, I heard his chair scrape against the floor. I quickly retreated to the kitchen, where I pretended to be getting water, when he emerged from his office. "Andy," he seemed startled to see me. "What are you doing up?" "Couldn't sleep. Just getting some water." I held up my glass as evidence. "You should try to rest. You've been working too hard lately." "What about you? It's past midnight." "Just finishing up some paperwork. Legal briefs wait for no one." He kissed my forehead, the gesture feeling perfunctory rather than affectionate, and headed toward his bedroom. I waited until I heard his door close, then crept back toward his office. He had locked it this time, but I remembered seeing him hide a spare key in the potted plant in the living room. My hands shook as I retrieved it and unlocked the office door. The room was dark, except for the streetlight filtering through the window. I didn't dare turn on the lamp, but there was enough light to see that Alan had left papers scattered across his desk. I approached carefully, afraid of making noise that might wake him. What I found there changed everything. The top document was a letter to someone named Vincent Torino, dated just 3 days earlier. The letterhead read, "Blackwood Legal Services," but the content had nothing to do with legitimate legal work. Vincent. The letter began. The arrangement we discussed is proceeding smoothly. The girl suspects nothing and her mother is fully cooperative. We should be ready to move forward with the next phase within the month. The investment you've made will pay dividends beyond what we originally projected. Investment. Next phase. I rifled through the other papers, finding more correspondence with the same Vincent Torino, as well as receipts for equipment I didn't recognize, and a detailed floor plan of our apartment with specific rooms marked and labeled. At the bottom of the stack was a contract that made my blood run cold. It was an agreement between Alan Blackwood and Torino Productions for the creation of what it called specialized adult entertainment content, featuring a young woman and an older female relative. The payment amount listed was $50,000 more money than I had ever imagined. My hands were shaking so badly I could barely hold the papers. The pieces of the puzzle suddenly clicked into place with horrible clarity. Alan had never loved me. This entire relationship, the rushed engagement, the decision to have us all live together, it was all part of an elaborate scheme to create pornographic films featuring me and my mother. I thought I might vomit right there on his pristine office floor. The man I had trusted with my heart, my future, my life, was nothing more than a predator who had identified me as easy prey. And my mother, my own mother, was part of it. I carefully returned the papers to their original positions and locked the office door behind me. Back in my room, I sat on the edge of my bed trying to decide what to do. Part of me wanted to pack my bags and leave immediately, but where would I go? We had sold our house. The money from the sale was in an account I couldn't access. I had less than $300 in my own savings account, barely enough for a week's rent anywhere in Denver. The smart thing would be to go to the police, but what evidence did I have? Letters discussing vague arrangements and investments that could be interpreted as legitimate business deals. A contract for adult films that didn't specifically name me. It would be my word against that of a respected lawyer, and I had no proof that anything illegal had actually occurred. No, I needed more evidence. I needed to catch them in the act. The opportunity came sooner than I expected. The next evening, Alan announced that he had a business meeting that would keep him out late. My mother claimed she was tired and would be going to bed early. I made a show of settling in for the evening, putting on my nightgown, and going through my usual bedtime routine. But instead of going to sleep, I positioned myself where I could watch both the front door and the hallway leading to my mother's room. At 11 o'clock, I heard the front door open quietly. Alan had returned, but instead of announcing his presence, he moved stealthily through the apartment. I watched from the shadows as he tapped softly on my mother's bedroom door. It opened immediately, as if she had been waiting for him. They embraced in the doorway, not the embrace of a man greeting his future mother-in-law, but the passionate embrace of lovers. I watched in horrified fascination as they kissed deeply, my mother's hands tangling in his hair, his hands roaming her body with obvious familiarity. They disappeared into her room, closing the door behind them. I crept closer, pressing my ear to the door, and heard sounds that left no doubt about what was happening inside. My mother and my fiancé were having sex not 20 feet from where I was supposed to be sleeping innocently. But even worse than the betrayal was what I heard them discussing afterward, their voices low, but audible through the thin walls. When my mother was asking, "Soon? Vincent is getting impatient. He's already invested too much money to wait much longer. What if she refuses? She won't have a choice. Once we explain her situation, no money, no home, no family to turn to, she'll cooperate. They always do. And afterward, after we get what we need, it won't matter what she does. Vincent has buyers lined up already. We'll make enough money to disappear if necessary." I fled back to my room, my heart pounding so hard I thought it might burst. They weren't just planning to use me in their sick scheme, they were planning to abandon me afterward, leaving me with nothing and no one. I spent the rest of the night planning my escape. I would pack my essential belongings, withdraw what little money I had from my savings account, and leave Denver. I would go somewhere they couldn't find me, start over completely. It would be difficult, but it had to be better than staying and allowing them to destroy me. But as I prepared to leave the next morning, Alan intercepted me at the door. "Going somewhere?" he asked, blocking my path with casual authority. "I was going to work early today. Mrs. Morrison needs help with inventory." "No, you weren't." His voice was flat matter-of-fact. "You were planning to run away. Your mother heard you moving around last night packing things." I looked past him and saw my mother standing in the hallway, still in her robe, her expression cold and calculating. There was no trace of the woman who had raised me, who had once kissed my scraped knees and braided my hair for school. "I know what you're doing," I said, surprised by how steady my voice sounded. "I know about Vincent Torino. I know about the films." Alan smiled, an expression devoid of warmth or humanity. "Good. That saves us the trouble of explaining it to you." "I won't do it. Whatever you're planning, I won't be part of it." "Oh, but you will," my mother said, stepping closer. "Because you don't have any other choice." Alan moved to stand beside her, and I realized with chilling clarity that I was facing two predators who had been hunting me from the beginning. Everything I had believed about my life, my relationships, my future, had been a carefully constructed lie. "Let me explain your situation, Andy," Alan said in the tone he might use to address a jury. "You have no money beyond what's in our joint account, which requires my signature to access. You have no home, we sold that. Remember, you have no family except your dear mother here, who is part of our little arrangement. You have a job that pays barely enough to cover food expenses, certainly not enough to rent a place to live in this city." "I'll find a way," I said desperately. "I'll get a second job, find roommates." "With what references? When I'm done with you, no one in Denver will hire you for anything. I have connections throughout this city, Andy. Judges, business owners, police officers. One word from me about your instability, and you'll be unemployable." My mother stepped forward, her voice taking on a mockery of maternal concern. "Darling, we're not asking you to do anything so terrible. It's just one film. A few hours of your time, and then you'll have enough money to live comfortably for years." "It's sick. You're my mother." "I'm a woman who deserves more than the life your father left me." She snapped her mask, finally slipping completely. "Do you think I enjoyed 22 years of marriage to a bus driver? Do you think I wanted to spend my life counting pennies and making dresses for women who had everything I wanted?" I stared at her, seeing a stranger wearing my mother's face. "He loved you. He worked himself to death, providing for us." "He was weak. He accepted his place in life instead of fighting for something better. I won't make that mistake. This isn't fighting for something better. This is degrading yourself, degrading me for money." Alan intervened, his voice hardening. "Enough philosophy. Here's what's going to happen, Andy. Tonight, we're going to make a film. You're going to participate willingly and enthusiastically. Afterward, you'll receive your share of the payment, enough to start a new life anywhere you choose. Refuse, and you'll find yourself on the streets with nothing but the clothes on your back. I'll go to the police and tell them that your fiancé and mother offered you money to appear in an adult film. That's not illegal, Andy. Immoral, perhaps, but not illegal. And by the time you convince anyone to investigate, we'll be long gone with your money." I looked between them, searching for any trace of the people I had loved and trusted. But there was nothing left of the charming man who had courted me so attentively, nothing of the mother who had once been my greatest protector. In their place were two cold, calculating strangers who saw me as nothing more than a commodity to be exploited. "I need time to think," I finally said, stalling for time while I tried to formulate a plan. "You have until tonight," Alan said. "We start filming at 9 o'clock. I spent that day in a haze of panic and desperate planning. I considered every possible escape route, every potential ally, every way out of the trap they had constructed around me. By evening, Only one plan seemed viable, and it required me to pretend to cooperate until I could turn the tables on them. At dinner, I forced myself to eat, though the food tasted like sawdust in my mouth. I made polite conversation, pretending to consider their proposal, while secretly planning their downfall. "I'll do it," I announced as we cleared the dinner dishes. "But I have conditions." Alan and my mother exchanged glances, surprised by my apparent capitulation. "What conditions?" Alan asked warily. "First, I want to see the money up front, $50,000 in cash before we start filming." "That's not how these arrangements work, Andy. Payment comes after delivery." "Then you don't get my cooperation. I'm not stupid enough to trust either of you at this point." They huddled together for a whispered conference, then Alan nodded reluctantly. "Fine. Vincent will have the money here within an hour. Second, I want a contract guaranteeing my payment and my safety. If anything goes wrong, if I'm hurt or threatened, the deal is off." "Agreed." "And third, I want to choose the location. Not here in the apartment. Somewhere neutral." Alan's eyes narrowed. "Why? Because if I'm going to do something I'll regret for the rest of my life, I don't want it happening in the place where I live. I don't want those memories contaminating every corner of my home." It was a reasonable request, and after another whispered consultation, they agreed. We would use a hotel room that Vincent would arrange somewhere discreet and comfortable. By 9 o'clock, everything was in place. Vincent Torino turned out to be a thin, nervous man with darting eyes and sweaty palms. He brought the money in a briefcase stacks of $20 bills that he counted out on Alan's desk while I watched. $50,000, just as promised. The hotel was downtown, a respectable establishment, where no one would question 3 people checking in together. Vincent had reserved a suite under a false name, complete with professional lighting equipment and multiple cameras. Clearly, this wasn't his first production. As we prepared to begin, I made my move. "I need to use the bathroom first," I announced. "To get ready." They nodded, distracted by the technical setup. Once alone in the bathroom, I locked the door and immediately began searching for anything I could use as a weapon or communication device. In the medicine cabinet, I found a small bottle of prescription sedatives, probably left by a previous guest. I pocketed them quickly, but more importantly, I discovered that the bathroom window led to a fire escape. It was a narrow opening, barely wide enough for a person to squeeze through, but it was my only chance at freedom. I opened the window as quietly as possible and looked down. We were on the 3rd floor, but the fire escape led to an alley where I could see people walking on the sidewalk beyond. If I could get down there, I could run to the police station 6 blocks away. But first, I needed to gather evidence. I returned to the main room where Vincent was adjusting the lighting while Alan and my mother discussed camera angles. On the table beside Vincent's equipment bag, I noticed a small cassette recorder probably meant to capture audio for the film. Instead, I quietly pressed the record button, then slipped the device into my pocket. "Ready?" Alan asked, his eyes gleaming with anticipation. "Almost," I said, moving closer to where he stood near the cameras. "Just one more thing." Before anyone could react, I grabbed the nearest camera and smashed it against the wall, sending pieces of glass and metal flying across the room. "Huh, what the hell?" Vincent started to shout, but I was already moving toward the second camera. Alan lunged for me, but I ducked under his grasp and sent the second camera crashing to the floor. The room erupted in chaos as all 3 of them converged on me, but I had already accomplished my primary goal, destroying their ability to film anything. "You little bitch!" My mother screamed, her face contorted with rage. "Do you have any idea how much those cameras cost?" "Less than my dignity," I replied, backing toward the bathroom. But I had underestimated their desperation. Vincent pulled a gun from his jacket, a small pistol that looked deadly in his shaking hands. "Nobody moves," he said, his voice high with panic. "This was a $50,000 investment. I'm not walking away with nothing." "Put the gun down, Vincent," Alan said, though his own voice betrayed his nervousness. "We can work this out. That's how the cameras are destroyed. The girl is uncooperative, and I'm out a fortune. There's only one way to salvage this situation." He pointed the gun directly at me. "Get in that bedroom and do what we brought you here to do, or I'll put a bullet in your head and find someone else who's more cooperative." I had seconds to make a decision that would determine whether I lived or died. The bathroom window was behind me, but I would never make it there before Vincent could shoot. The hotel room door was across the room, blocked by Alan and my mother. My only chance was to create enough confusion to give myself an opportunity to escape. I pulled the bottle of sedatives from my pocket and held it up for them to see. You want cooperation, fine, but I need something to calm my nerves first. These should do the trick. Before anyone could stop me, I opened the bottle and swallowed half the pills inside. The effect wasn't immediate, but I could already feel a strange detachment settling over me, as if I were watching the scene from outside my own body. What did you just do? Alan demanded. Ensured that whatever you do to me, I won't remember much of it, I said, surprised by how calm my voice sounded. Those were heavy-duty sedatives. In about 10 minutes, I'll be unconscious. Vincent's face went white. We can't film an unconscious woman. That's not what the buyers want. Then you'd better work fast, I replied, settling into a chair as the drugs began to take effect. Or find another solution to your problem. The three of them huddled together in urgent consultation, while I sat quietly feeling the room beginning to spin slightly around me. But beneath the growing haze of the medication, my mind remained sharp and focused on one goal: survival. After several minutes of heated, whispered discussion, Alan approached me with a glass of water. Drink this, he ordered. It will help you vomit up the pills. I shook my head. Too late. They're already in my system. Then we'll take you to a hospital, get your stomach pumped, and explain to the doctors how I came to overdose in a hotel room with filming equipment and $50,000 in cash. That should be an interesting conversation. I could see the panic growing in their eyes as they realized their carefully planned scheme was falling apart. Vincent was pacing frantically around the room, gesturing wildly with his gun. My mother sat on the edge of the bed, her head in her hands. Alan stood frozen in the center of the room for once in his life, at a loss for words. That's when I made my final move. There is one way to salvage this, I said, forcing my voice to remain steady despite the increasing effects of the sedatives. But it requires honesty. Complete honesty about what you've been planning, what you've already done, and who else is involved. What are you talking about? Alan asked suspiciously. I pulled the cassette recorder from my pocket and held it up. I've been recording everything since we got here. Every word, every confession, every threat. Right now, it's just evidence of a conspiracy that went wrong. But if something happens to me, if I die from this overdose or disappear mysteriously, this tape will find its way to the police. The silence that followed was deafening. Vincent lowered his gun slowly, his face ashen. My mother looked up at me with something that might have been respect flickering in her eyes. Alan's expression cycled through rage, calculation, and finally defeated recognition. You planned this, he said quietly. The whole thing. The compliance, the conditions, even the overdose. You planned it all. I learned from the best, I replied, fighting to keep my words from slurring as the drugs took stronger hold. You taught me that sometimes you have to be willing to sacrifice everything to get what you want. The difference is, what I want is freedom. What you want is money. Well, what do you want from us? Vincent asked, sliding his gun back into his jacket. I want you to tell me everything. The whole truth about how this started, who else is involved, what other victims you've targeted. I want names, dates, places, everything. And in exchange, I disappear. You never see me again, never contact me, never come looking for me. And maybe this recording doesn't end up in the hands of the Denver Police Department. They looked at each other, weighing their options. Finally, Alan nodded. Vincent runs a network of adult film producers throughout the western states. He began, his voice flat and emotionless. They specialize in content that mainstream producers won't touch. Incest, violence, coercion. I was recruited 6 months ago when my law practice started failing. How? I owed money to the wrong people. Vincent offered me a way out, identify potential victims, set up scenarios, provide legal cover if needed. In exchange, I'd get a percentage of the profits. And my mother, Alan glanced at her, and she spoke for herself. her voice barely above a whisper. "He approached me after your father's funeral. Told me he could give me the life I'd always wanted if I was willing to help. All I had to do was encourage your relationship with him and participate when the time came."
"How many other families have you destroyed?" 6. Vincent answered, his voice hollow. "Mothers and daughters mostly, sometimes sisters. We target families in financial distress, women who are vulnerable after losing their primary income source."
The room was starting to blur around the edges, and I knew I didn't have much time before the sedatives rendered me unconscious. But I had what I needed.
"The money," I said, pointing toward the briefcase. "That stays with me. Consider it compensation for attempted rape, kidnapping, and psychological torture. That's our investment."
Vincent started to protest.
"Now, that was your investment in destroying my life," I interrupted. "Now it's going to fund my escape from you. Unless you'd prefer to explain to the police why you brought $50,000 in cash to film pornography involving a mother and daughter."
They had no choice but to agree. As the sedatives pulled me deeper into unconsciousness, I heard them making hurried arrangements to leave the hotel, to abandon their scheme to pretend this night had never happened. When I woke up 12 hours later, they were gone. The room was empty except for the broken camera equipment and the briefcase full of money. I had won, but the victory felt hollow and poisonous.
I used some of the money to check into a different hotel under a false name, then spent 3 days recovering from the overdose and planning my next move. The cassette recording was safely locked in a deposit box at a downtown bank, along with copies of all the documents I had found in Alan's office. If anything happened to me, if I disappeared or died under mysterious circumstances, the evidence would be mailed automatically to the police and the Denver Post.
But I didn't want revenge anymore. I wanted to disappear. On the 4th day, I withdrew $20,000 from the briefcase and left the rest in the bank deposit box, along with a letter explaining everything that had happened. If other victims came forward, if the police investigated Vincent's network, the money would be there to help them rebuild their lives. I bought a bus ticket to San Francisco under an assumed name, leaving Denver behind forever. The last thing I did before leaving was mail a letter to Mrs. Morrison at the bakery, explaining that I had to leave town for personal reasons and thanking her for her kindness. I never saw Alan, my mother, or Vincent again. But 6 months later, while working as a waitress in a small cafe near Fisherman's Wharf, I read a small article in the Denver Post about the arrest of a lawyer named Alan Blackwood in connection with an adult film production ring. The article mentioned that several victims had come forward with evidence of coercion and fraud. My mother's name wasn't mentioned in the article, but I knew she was somewhere in the shadows of that story, reaping the consequences of her choices. It took me 3 years to stop looking over my shoulder, 3 years to believe that I was truly free from the nightmare they had created. During that time, I worked various jobs: waitress, hotel clerk, bookkeeper, always using false names, always moving on before I could form attachments that might lead to questions about my past. The nightmares took longer to fade. For years, I would wake up in cold sweats, reliving that horrible night in the hotel room, feeling the betrayal of discovering that my own mother saw me as nothing more than a commodity to be sold. But gradually, with the help of a therapist I met in Portland, I began to heal.
Dr. Sarah Chen was a small woman with kind eyes and an infinite capacity for patience. She worked with victims of trauma, specializing in cases involving family betrayal and abuse. When I finally found the courage to tell her my story, she listened without judgment, without shock, without the pity I had feared. "What your mother and Alan did to you wasn't about love or desperation," she explained during one of our sessions. "It was about power and control. They identified you as someone who could be manipulated, and they constructed an elaborate trap designed to make you feel like you had no choices."
"But I did have choices," I protested. "I could have left earlier, could have seen through their lies.
Could you? You were 20 years old, grieving your father's death, struggling to support yourself and your mother. They deliberately isolated you, made you financially dependent, and then systematically destroyed your trust in your own instincts. That's not your failure, Andy. That's their crime. Through months of therapy, I began to understand that I wasn't responsible for their betrayal. I began to reclaim my sense of self-worth, to trust my own judgment again. Most importantly, I began to believe that I deserved a life free from fear and manipulation. It was during my time in Portland that I met Michael. He was nothing like Alan, where Alan had been smooth and calculated. Michael was genuine and straightforward. He worked as a carpenter, building custom furniture for local artisans. His hands were calloused from honest work. His smile was warm without being predatory. And when he looked at me, I felt seen rather than studied. We met at the library, where I spent my evenings reading, trying to educate myself beyond the high school diploma I'd barely earned. He was researching restoration techniques for an antique desk he was repairing, and I was working through a basic accounting textbook, teaching myself skills that might lead to better employment. That's a tough subject to tackle alone, he said, nodding toward my textbook. I took some business courses at the community college a few years back. The accounting stuff nearly killed me. I looked up, startled by the interruption. I had trained myself to avoid eye contact with men, to discourage any interaction that might lead to personal questions about my background. But something in his tone, casual, friendly, without any underlying agenda, made me respond. I'm hoping it will help me find better work. Waitressing doesn't exactly offer career advancement. Are you thinking of starting your own business? The question surprised me. I hadn't considered that possibility, but as soon as he said it, something clicked into place. Maybe. I've always been good with numbers, and I like the idea of being my own boss. That takes courage, he said, closing his own book. Starting over, building something from nothing, not everyone has that kind of strength. If only he knew, I thought. But instead, I simply said, sometimes you don't have a choice. We began meeting regularly at the library, ostensibly to study, but increasingly to talk. Michael had a way of asking questions that invited honesty without demanding it. He shared stories about his own life, growing up in a large Irish family in Boston, learning carpentry from his father, moving west to escape the suffocating expectations of a life already mapped out for him. I wanted to build things with my own hands, he told me one evening as we walked along the Willamette River. Create something beautiful and functional that would outlast me. My father wanted me to take over the family plumbing business, but that felt like accepting someone else's definition of success. What does success mean to you? I asked. Being able to look at myself in the mirror and respect what I see. Being honest with the people who matter to me. Creating more beauty in the world than I destroy. He glanced at me sideways. What about you? What does success look like for Andy? The question haunted me for weeks. What did success mean for someone who had lost everything, who had been betrayed by the people she trusted most, who was living under a false name in a city where no one knew her real story? Gradually, the answer began to take shape. Success meant never again being vulnerable to someone else's manipulation. It meant building a life based on my own choices rather than other people's expectations. It meant learning to trust my instincts again, to form relationships based on mutual respect rather than need or desperation. Michael and I grew closer, slowly, carefully. I was honest about having a difficult past without sharing specifics. He respected my boundaries without pushing for details I wasn't ready to share. When he finally kissed me 6 months after we met, it felt like a choice rather than a surrender. I care about you, Andy, he said afterward, his forehead resting against mine. Whatever happened to you before whoever hurt you, it doesn't change how I feel. But I need you to know that I'm not going anywhere unless you tell me to go. I cried then, not from sadness, but from relief. For the first time since that horrible night in Denver, I felt truly safe with another person. We were married 2 years later in a simple ceremony in his sister's backyard in Seattle. I wore a pale blue dress I had made myself,
and he wore a suit his father had worn to his own wedding 30 years earlier. We exchanged vows we had written ourselves, promising honesty, patience, and the courage to build something beautiful together. "I take you as you are," Michael said, his voice steady and sure. "With your past, your fears, your dreams, your strength. I promise to love the woman you are today, and the woman you're still becoming." My own vows were simpler. I promise to trust you with my heart, to be honest about my fears, and to build our future together with my own hands. We moved to a small town in Montana where Michael had been offered a job restoring the woodwork in a historic courthouse. I used my savings from Portland to open a small bookkeeping service working with local businesses that couldn't afford a full-time accountant. For the first time since my father's death, I felt like I was building something that belonged entirely to me. Our first child, Sarah, was born 3 years later. Holding her tiny body against my chest, I understood what my father had meant when he told me that some things were more precious than money or status. This little girl with her perfect fingers and her father's green eyes represented everything I had thought I'd lost: the possibility of genuine love, of family, of hope for the future. Michael was a devoted father, patient and gentle in ways that reminded me of my own father's best qualities. Watching him teach Sarah to walk, to read, to use tools in his workshop, I began to understand that the capacity for love and protection hadn't died with my father. It lived on in people like Michael, in the choice to nurture rather than exploit, to build rather than destroy. When Sarah was 5 and our son David was 2, I finally told Michael the complete truth about my past. We were sitting on our porch one evening, watching the children play in the yard, when I found the courage to speak the words I had held inside for so long. I told him about my father's death, about meeting Alan, about discovering the betrayal and the horrible scheme they had planned. I told him about the hotel room, the recording, the escape that had saved my life, but cost me my family and my identity. He listened without interruption, his face growing more serious as the story unfolded. When I finished, he was quiet for a long time, processing what I had shared. "Thank you," he finally said. "For what?" "For trusting me with the truth. For being strong enough to survive what they did to you. For building a life beautiful enough that you could share it with me and the children. Aren't you angry, upset that I lied about who I was?" "You didn't lie about who you were, Andy. You just didn't tell me about who you used to be. There's a difference." He took my hand, his calloused thumb tracing circles on my palm. "That scared young woman who had to change her name and flee across the country, she was brave and resourceful and determined to survive. This woman sitting beside me now, she's kind and funny and the best mother our children could ask for. You're both the same person, just at different points in your journey." "I was afraid you'd see me differently." "I do see you differently. I see you as even stronger than I thought, even more remarkable for everything you've overcome." That night, for the first time in years, I slept without nightmares. Over the following years, I occasionally searched for news about Alan and Vincent's prosecution. I learned that they had been convicted on multiple charges, including conspiracy, fraud, and racketeering. Alan received 15 years in federal prison. Vincent received 25. My mother was never formally charged, but according to court records, she testified against them in exchange for immunity. I felt no satisfaction in their punishment, no sense of justice served. What they had done to me was irreversible, and their imprisonment couldn't undo the years of therapy, the sleepless nights, the constant vigilance that had shaped my recovery. But I was glad that other potential victims would be protected from their predatory scheme. More difficult was coming to terms with my mother's role in my betrayal. For years, I cycled through anger, grief, and a desperate desire to understand how the woman who had raised me could have participated in such cruelty. Dr. Chen helped me recognize that my mother's choices reflected her own damage, her own fears and weaknesses, rather than any failure on my part as a daughter. Some people respond to hardship by becoming stronger and more compassionate.
she explained. Others respond by becoming willing to hurt anyone to avoid being hurt themselves. Your mother chose the second path, but that doesn't mean her love for you was never real. It means that her fear and desperation became stronger than her love. I never attempted to contact my mother, and she never tried to reach me. According to public records, she died in 1987 of complications from alcoholism. When I learned of her death, I felt only a hollow sadness for the relationship we had lost, and the mother she might have been under different circumstances. My children grew up knowing only the broad outlines of my past, that I had lost my parents young and had to start over in a new place. They knew me as a woman who valued honesty and independence, who taught them to trust their instincts and never accept treatment that made them feel diminished or afraid. Sarah became a social worker drawn to helping families in crisis. David became a teacher patient and encouraging with children who struggled academically. Both of them inherited their father's kindness and their grandfather's integrity traits that had been temporarily lost in my family line but were restored through conscious choice and careful nurturing. As I grew older, I began to understand that my father's greatest gift to me hadn't been his protection or his love, though both were precious. It had been his example of how to live with dignity, how to work honestly, how to put family before personal ambition. Those lessons had sustained me through the darkest period of my life and had guided me in building something better. On my 50th birthday, Michael surprised me with a trip back to Denver. I hadn't been to Colorado since fleeing 27 years earlier, and I wasn't sure I was ready to confront the ghosts that remained there. "You don't have to see anyone or go anywhere that makes you uncomfortable," he assured me. "But you've talked about your father so often, about the good memories you had there. I thought you might want to visit his grave, maybe see the neighborhood where you grew up." We flew into Denver on a clear autumn day, the mountains visible in the distance, the city spread out below us like a patchwork quilt. So much had changed: new buildings, new roads, areas that had been farmland, now covered with subdivisions. But the essential character of the place remained the same. My father's grave was in Riverside Cemetery, a modest headstone marking the place where Anthony Moretti rested. I knelt beside it, placing a bouquet of white roses and speaking to him as if he could hear me. "I'm sorry I disappeared, Papa. I'm sorry I couldn't visit you all these years. But I think you would be proud of the life I built. I found a good man who treats me with respect. I raised children who know the difference between right and wrong. I survived what they tried to do to me, and I never let it make me cruel or bitter." The house where I had grown up was still there, though it had been painted a different color, and the garden looked different. I stood across the street, remembering the girl I had been, young, trusting, naive, but also brave in ways I hadn't recognized at the time. That evening, Michael and I had dinner at a restaurant downtown, not far from the building where Alan's law office had been. The building now housed a coffee shop, and I felt no trace of the fear that had once consumed me in this part of the city. "How does it feel to be back?" Michael asked as we walked through the streets of my childhood. "Like closing a circle," I said. For so long, this place represented everything I was running from. Now it just feels like part of my history, painful, but not powerful enough to hurt me anymore. We returned home to Montana the next day, but something had shifted inside me during those few days in Denver. I no longer felt like a refugee from my own life. I felt like a woman who had survived a terrible experience and had used that survival to build something meaningful. Now at 68, I spend my days tending my garden, reading to my grandchildren, and helping other women who have survived trauma and betrayal. I volunteer at a local shelter, teaching basic business skills to women who are starting over after leaving abusive relationships. Sometimes, when they're ready to hear it, I share parts of my own story. The thing about survival, I tell them, is that it's not just about getting through the worst moments. It's about what you build with the strength you discover in yourself during those moments. Michael and I have been married for 43 years now. His hair is silver, His hands show the wear of decades of careful craftsmanship, but his eyes still light up when he sees me across a room. Our love has deepened with time, seasoned by shared challenges and small daily kindnesses. Sometimes, late at night when we're both reading in bed, I'll look at him and feel a wave of gratitude so intense it brings tears to my eyes. Not just gratitude for his love, but for the lesson he taught me about trust, that it's possible to open your heart again after it's been broken. Possible to build intimacy based on mutual respect rather than need or manipulation. My children call regularly, share their own struggles and triumphs, ask for advice that I try to give without being pushy. They're both happily married now, raising children of their own, with the same combination of love and clear boundaries that Michael and I tried to model for them. Sarah's oldest daughter, Emma, reminds me of myself at that age, curious, determined, sometimes too trusting for her own good. When she asks me about the old days, about what life was like when I was young, I tell her stories about her great-grandfather Anthony, about his kindness and his work ethic and his absolute devotion to family. "Will you tell me about great-grandmother Irene?" she asked recently. I thought carefully before answering. She was a complicated woman who made some very bad choices, but she loved beautiful things, and she was talented at creating them. Most importantly, she helped create your grandfather, who was one of the best men I've ever known. It's not the whole truth, but it's true enough for a 12-year-old girl who deserves to feel proud of her heritage rather than burdened by its shadows. The nightmares stopped years ago, replaced by dreams of the life I've built and the future my grandchildren will inherit. Sometimes I dream about my father young and strong again, telling me he's proud of the woman I became. Sometimes I dream about alternate versions of my story, what might have happened if I had been less trusting, if my mother had been stronger, if Alan had been the man he pretended to be. But I don't waste time regretting the path I walked. That naive 20-year-old girl who believed in fairy tales and happy endings didn't know that she possessed the strength to survive betrayal, to start over with nothing, to build a life worth living from the ashes of her shattered trust. She had to discover that strength the hard way. But once she found it, it became the foundation for everything that followed. The most surprising discovery of my adult life has been that happiness isn't the absence of pain or struggle. It's the presence of meaning, connection, and purpose that make the pain and struggle worthwhile. I found meaning in survival, connection in love freely given and received, and purpose in helping others find their own strength. If I could speak to that frightened girl hiding in a hotel bathroom 45 years ago, I would tell her, hold on, fight back, trust yourself. The people who are hurting you want you to believe that you're powerless, but they're wrong. You have more strength than you know, and you're going to need every bit of it. But you're going to make it through this, and what you build on the other side will be more beautiful than anything you've lost. I would tell her that love, real love, exists, but it looks nothing like the manipulation and control she has mistaken for affection. Real love is patient and respectful. It builds you up rather than tearing you down. It trusts your judgment rather than undermining it. It celebrates your independence rather than trying to eliminate it. Most importantly, I would tell her that she is not responsible for other people's cruelty, that survival is not a betrayal of the people who have hurt her, and that healing is possible even when it seems impossible. The sun is setting now over the mountains outside my kitchen window, painting the sky in shades of rose and gold that remind me why I fell in love with the American West all those years ago. Michael is in his workshop putting the finishing touches on a rocking chair for our newest grandchild. The sound of his careful craftsmanship, the whisper of sandpaper, the soft tap of his hammer, creates a soundtrack of productivity and care that has become the music of my contentment. Tomorrow, I'll drive into town to help at the shelter, to listen to women whose stories echo my own in painful ways, to offer practical advice and emotional support to those who are just beginning their own journeys toward freedom. I'll remind them that they are stronger than they know, braver than they feel, and worthy of love that nurtures rather than exploits. I'll tell them what I wish someone had told me at 20, that betrayal by those who should protect us is not a reflection of our worth, but of their weakness. That survival is not enough. We must also heal, grow, and eventually learn to thrive. That the greatest victory over those who try to destroy us is not revenge, but the decision to build something beautiful from the wreckage they leave behind. This is my story. It began with betrayal and trauma, but it doesn't end there. It ends with love, family purpose, and the hard-won knowledge that we are all stronger than our worst moments, more resilient than our deepest fears, and capable of creating meaning from even the most senseless suffering. The little girl who once believed in fairy tales learned that real life is both darker and more beautiful than any story. She learned that happy endings aren't given, they're built day by day, choice by choice, with courage and patience, and the unwavering belief that we all deserve better than what those who would harm us want us to accept. She learned that sometimes the greatest strength comes from the deepest betrayal, and that the darkest nights really can give birth to the brightest dawn.